All right, hello everyone. So hello, bonjour, Annie. Welcome everyone. We're really excited for tonight's event, which will be looking not only just at the orchids that are on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, but also at the conservation work and the natural history that surrounds them. We're here, thank you to our lovely hosts, the Friends of the Bruce District Parks Association, and our speakers from the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Arts. So my name is Carolyn Holmes. I'm one of the outdoor education coordinators at Bruce Peninsula National Park and Fathom 5 National Marine Park in Tobermory. As you all may know, this is a webinar, so while you can see and hear me, and you'll be able to see and hear our other panelists and presenters, your video is turned off and you are muted, and it will remain that way for the duration of the evening. Although you hear your voices, you are able to speak in the chat feature if you'd like to, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen, and then you can click on that conversation bubble titled chat. If you want, you're welcome to start a conversation there you're tuning in from, and that chat feature, you can speak to one another, but if you have questions, we ask that you use the Q&A button feature at the bottom of your screen. So my coworker, Maddie, will be moderating those Q&As for tonight's presentations. And speakers will answer their questions at the end of their presentations, and we won't be using the raise hand feature this evening, so just ignore that one if that's all right. Before we get going any further, I just want to acknowledge that although you guys may all be joining from different locations, the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula is the traditional territory of the Saugeen of the Anishinaabe Nation. So those are the people of the three fires, known as the Ojibwe, the Chippewa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. So we'd like to further give thanks to the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation as the traditional keepers of this land. Now, hopefully by now, we've got most of the people who will be joining us this evening. So I'd like to pass the floor over to Sheila Buckingham, who is a board member of the Friends of the Bruce District Park Association.
Hello, am I on? All right. Hi, welcome to the 2020 Orchid Festival. Thank you, Carolyn. We truly regret that we could not invite you into the field this year, but we hope that the information and the images that you're going to see tonight will inspire you for a future visit when it's safe to do that. Tonight's event is a partnership between Parks Canada and the Friends of the Bruce District Parks, who work on many levels supporting parks in the peninsula and also in the community. We do this annual festival, have done for many years. We also run a program out at Flower Pot Island for visiting lightkeepers. And it keeps our volunteers busy year round. There's all sorts of things that people can do to become involved. During intermission, we will be showing our website address, and we encourage you to take a look at that so that you can learn more or perhaps even become involved. As I mentioned, we act in partnership on this festival with Parks Canada, and tonight I would gladly give almost all the credit for this occurring to Parks Canada, their resources, and most specifically to Carolyn, who has worked tirelessly to pull this together. I'd also like to thank Heather Keast, who was busy preparing for her first festival as chair until we had to rethink the event. Tonight's presenters were already confirmed by Heather, and we're delighted that they have been able to make themselves available in this format to share their knowledge with you. And let's not forget to thank the presenters themselves, John Alexander, Peter Kalgren, and Esme Batten, who are all volunteering their time and expertise. And finally, as the planet is taking a breath while we're all slowing down our frantic lives a little bit, I hope that you are getting out and experiencing some nature to help with stress levels. And we feel that tonight's presentation will be a reminder of the past festivals that you may have attended, and certainly a promise for future festivals that we hope you will attend. Thanks again.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm really excited for everyone to meet our panelists this evening. So as Sheila mentioned, we have Dr. Peter Kalgren, John Alexander from Alexander Arts, and Esme Batten from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So each presentation will speak to local orchids found on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, and the presentations will be about 40 minutes long, followed by a question and answer period where, like I had mentioned, my coworker Maddie will be reading out the questions that have been asked in that Q&A section. Between those presentations, we'll have a short bio break, give you time to grab a drink or a snack, stretch your legs, or just enjoy the slideshow of some really beautiful orchid photos taken by Bill Caulfield Brown. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first presenters, Peter Kalgren and John Alexander. Dr. Peter Kalgren is Curator Emeritus of Decorative Arts for the Royal Ontario Museum. He has been published internationally in journals and publications in his areas of expertise. And John Alexander is a retired retail manager who has been photographing since his teens. With encouragement of their friends, the late Allison and David Stein, Peter and John have been traveling our country, photographing and documenting our native orchids. They've enjoyed many trips to the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula in search of the beauty of our native wildflowers and orchids. Together, they have given numerous presentations about their travels to field naturalist groups, horticultural societies, libraries, and orchid societies. Their first presentation was actually here at Orchid Fest 2014, meanwhile in another part of the Fen. So they hope that you enjoy their presentation about orchids of the Saugeen Bruce, and I'm happy to welcome John and Peter.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Can you hear me okay?
Oh. And just trying to share the screen here. And there we go.
Okay. A season of orchids on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula. Welcome to Orchid Fest. This annual gathering gives participants a rare opportunity to gain appreciation of the unique ecosystems of the Bruce Peninsula, which has been designated an important site by UNESCO. Jutting up between Georgian Bay on the east and Lake Huron on the west, the Bruce Peninsula is home to a distinctive and sometimes unique range of plants, amphibians, fish, birds, and animals. Approximately 27% of the land is protected by conservation regulations. One of the great treasures of the Bruce Peninsula is the 40 or so native orchids that have been documented as growing there. Orchids are one of the most fascinating plants in the world. Growing on every continent except Antarctica, they constitute the largest family of blooming flowers in the world, with over 25,000 species and more than 100,000 varieties. Their numbers continue to increase as new varieties are discovered or hybridized. Orchids range from tiny miniatures 2.5 to 5 centimeters high to a meter or taller. The Orchidaceae, as the family is now commonly called, are perennial monocotyledonous plants. Grasses and lilies are their closest relations. Most orchids have oval or blade-shaped green leaves. The majority of orchids grow in the tropics, usually without soil and with exposed roots. These tropical orchids are called epiphytes if they grow on trees, or lithophytes if they are found growing on rocks. The classic orchid bloom consists of 3 sepals and 3 petals, with the central one enlarged into a lip and usually having a different shape and color. Varieties in cooler climates like Canada are terrestrial, which means they grow in the ground. Over 70 varieties have been documented as growing in Canada. Interestingly, only about 55 varieties can be found in the British Isles. Many of those are threatened or endangered due to poaching and habitat loss. Although my partner John Alexander and I have both been engaged with nature our entire lives, our interest in native orchids was awakened around 2013 by our friends Allison and David Stein, who had retired to Arnprior, Ontario. Allison's uncle, Charles McNamara, 1870 to 1944, was an avid botanist whose notes and photographs of Ontario orchids are preserved in the archives at Arnprior. The Steins encouraged us to pursue a new passion. finding and photographically documenting all of the orchids that grow in Canada. Because many of these plants are rare or endangered and do not come up and bloom every year, this quest has been a matter of research, persistence, luck, and tips from knowledgeable naturalists and members of the public. We enjoy whatever we encounter along the way. John and I are not trained botanists. We are simply enthusiastic amateurs open to learning more about the beauties of Canada and how to conserve and appreciate them. You are looking at a map of the Bruce Peninsula. In addition to conservation areas established by the Bruce Grey Saugeen Nature Conservancy and other organizations, there are a number of national and provincial parks on the Bruce Peninsula that are set aside for tourism and nature preservation. The most important of these is Fathom 5 National Park, which includes underwater shipwrecks, and Flower Pot Island. Flower Pot Island has been known since the early 1800s. It is named for the eroded rock formations along its coast, which look like flower pots on pedestals. For well over a century, Flower Pot, with its forest of many ancient trees, has been a tourist destination almost on a par with Niagara Falls. Because of its soils and geography, it offers ideal conditions for an exceptional number of native orchids. A number of the orchids I will be showing were photographed on Flower Pot. The island can only be accessed by a scheduled ferry service and a paid pass from Fathom 5 National Park. Now, let's recap some basic information. Over 70 species of orchids are native to Canada. All of them are terrestrial, which means they grow in the ground. Because they are so rare and sensitive and are a national treasure that belongs to all of us, you should never pick, dig up, or move any of our native orchids. Doing that will only kill them. They belong to all Canadians. Orchids on the Bruce are a tourist attraction which bring in visitors who come to see them and help to support the local economy, schools, and roads. Canada's native orchids grow in very specific environments and need certain fungi in the soil to survive. Many are rare and protected by law. Penalties include fines and jail time. Conservationists have noted that the biggest challenges faced by our native orchids are picking and poaching, trampling by humans or dogs, invasive species like poison ivy, strangling dog vine, and garlic mustard, and habitat destruction. For example, when a road is widened or trees are chopped down. Because people are so fascinated by orchids, we often love them to death. John Alexander and I have used the orchids of Bruce and Grey as our guide when studying orchids on the Bruce Peninsula. Bruce Grey, plant of the Owen Sound Field Naturalists. This is currently the reliable book in print that documents orchids in Ontario, particularly the 40+ species found on the peninsula. The book provides suggested blooming times, which we have used to organize the sequence in our presentation. Whenever possible, we'll show examples of the plants growing on the Bruce Peninsula. In a number of cases, we have had to substitute plants from other Ontario locations for ones we have yet to discover on the Bruce. Perhaps the earliest of these is the Calypso, or fairy slipper orchid, which is at most 7.5 centimeters tall, with a small round leaf at the base of its stem. The Bruce Peninsula represents the easternmost range for this orchid, which can be found in large colonies in British Columbia. These blossoms were photographed on Flower Pot Island. Professor Paul Catling, who is one of the foremost experts on Ontario orchids, pointed out in a talk in 2019 that rising temperatures caused by climate change are reducing the number and range of the Calypso on the Bruce. That year, John and I could document only 3 Calypsos blooming in 2 locations. The long-bracted green orchid, sometimes called the frog orchid because its center looks like a frog's face, is difficult to find. usually 20 to 25 centimeters tall, May to mid-June. Many of Canada's native orchids are green and often small, which means they are difficult to see among grass and leaves. This example was photographed in Cathedral Woods. During the second half of May, it is sometimes possible to find the showy orchis blooming in mature deciduous woodlands on the Bruce Peninsula. It can be found in the company of maidenhair fern, trilliums, hepatica, and wild leeks. In August 2015, we discovered the leaves of a large single plant and returned 3 times the following May before it was in full bloom. Our native orchids decide to bloom only when the conditions are ideal. In 2017, this clump produced only leaves. Most wild orchids in Canada are found only as single plants or scattered examples, though the books will tell you that in an ideal ecosystem, they can be locally prolific. The ecosystems in the Bruce often include roadsides with low vegetation and dappled shade. These prove ideal for the yellow lady slipper, which can sometimes be found in a clump with as many as 30 blooming plants. The variety Cypripedium parviflorum variant pubescens, which has greenish petals, is considered to be the earlier ones. It usually grows to be 20 to 30 centimeters tall. Be sure to practice physical distancing with these and all native orchids and get no closer than a meter. The weight of the human body can compact the soil, which reduces the circulation of oxygen and thereby kills the fungus and the roots of the plants. One of the smallest and most difficult find orchids on the Bruce Peninsula, small colony growing at the end of Boardwalk 4 along the Marl Bed Trail on Flowerpot Island. The orchid is 5 centimeters taller or less with blossoms. If you look at the one image there, you can see my finger pointing to the orchid, so it gives you some idea of the size. This orchid can be found in greater numbers in British Columbia, where we have seen thousands growing along the Berg Trail to Mount Robson. Come June, one can find a greater range of orchids blooming on the Bruce. Striped coral root is named for the darker pink stripes in its flowers. This clump was photographed on Flowerpot Island. It is the easiest coral root orchid to find on the Bruce, as it blooms on the mainland on Flowerpot from early June to early July. The coral root orchids are named for their roots, which look rather like a clump of marine coral from an ocean reef. Most have no chlorophyll and do not do any photosynthesis, relying instead on a specific fungus in the soil, which gathers nutrients from the rotting forest floor and shares these and water with the orchid and a tree. The ram's head lady slipper is named because the petals and pouch look very much like the head of a ram. At less than 20 centimeters, it begins blooming in early June, usually in sandy soil at the edge of coniferous trees. These examples were photographed at the Singing Sands Conservation Area. Scattered examples, some as short as 6 centimeters in clumps, can be found growing in other locations. Although called the early coral root, this variety is more often found blooming in June. It can be as short as 6 centimeters and found as scattered single examples or a clump of 6 or more. The early coral root often has a greenish tint and is considered the only coral root to make food through photosynthesis. This may be because some plants emerge before the leaves have come out on the trees, which means they can absorb energy from the sun. This specimen was photographed along the Marl Bed Trail. Other examples have been found on the peninsula. One never knows where it will turn up. This is the only one of the coral roots that can be found in northern forests around the world. The other varieties are all unique to North America. Hooker's orchid was named for a famous English botanist who was among the first to study orchids in the early 1800s. The name is actually very appropriate because the lower petal looks much like an upturned hook. This example was blooming in mid-June at a conservation area near Sauble Beach. Again, it is difficult to find because it is less than 18 centimeters and green and often overshadowed by ferns and other taller plants. By June, the small yellow lady slipper can be found blooming on the Bruce. Often 20 centimeters or shorter, it is distinguished by its darker brown sepals. Sometimes fresh blossoms can have a spicy scent. The two varieties of yellow lady slippers are not always easy to distinguish because they often grow close together. Plants can be similar in size and they bloom at nearly the same time. However, none of that detracts from their beauty. The moccasin flower, also known as the pink lady slipper, is named for its resemblance to deerskin moccasins made by the First Nations. It became the provincial flower for Prince Edward Island just before 1967, when authorities discovered that populations of the rare showy lady slippers orchids were being poached because it was the official provincial flower. Moccasin flowers can be abundant in the right growing conditions, often within a pine woods. John Alexander, who took all of these photographs of orchids that grow on the Bruce Peninsula, decided to combine all of the ones that could be blooming at the usual time of Orchid Fest in Tobermory at the beginning of June. How many of them can you remember? By mid to late June, a whole range of new orchids begin to bloom on the Bruce. One of the most elusive is the putty root, which grows in established deciduous forests. From summer through winter and into early spring, the location of plants is marked by an oval green leaf with white stripes that lies on the dead leaves covering the forest floor. Sometime between mid and late June, stems of pale pinkish or purplish blooms, no more than 20 centimeters tall, are produced by some of the plants. The name comes from the bulb of this plant, which was sometimes dug up in pioneer times to use for mending china and other items. It worked much like old-fashioned window putty. Another difficult to discover orchid is the Arethusa, or dragon's mouth, so named because people thought the blossom resembled the head of a mythical dragon. Arethusa favors very wet environments, often hiding in the dry grass around the base of larch and other trees in bogs and swamps. No taller than 6 to 8 centimeters, Arethusa can appear in various shades of pale mauve or pink, and occasionally in white. The tall northern green orchid is easier to find. It favors damp areas among the grass or occasionally woodlands and sometimes the sandy edges of paths along the beach or along a road. It can grow anywhere from 6 to 75 centimeters tall and has long glossy leaves that look somewhat like those on a cornstalk. A few dense clumps can be observed growing along the boardwalks at Petrel Point Conservation Area. Its usual blooming time is late June through to July. Because orchid seeds are extremely small and easily transported, the number of British and European orchids have immigrated to Canada. The common European common twayblade is a good example. It was first discovered growing in the area of Red Bay along the west coast of the Bruce in 1968. Since then, colonies have expanded to a number of locations. Blooming from mid-June to early July, plants can be up to 25 centimeters tall. Even tiny seedlings, 2.5 centimeters tall, without blossoms, exhibit the same robust pair of glossy, rounded leaves. The opposed pair of leaves gives the twayblades their name. The showy lady slipper, or Cypripedium reginae, was first discovered by French explorers in Canada in the early 1600s. As early as 1635, it was illustrated in a French botanical text and named in honor of Mary, the Queen of Heaven. Growing to a meter or more in height, with up to 3 blooms the size of a fist on mature plants in good locations, this is one of the most impressive of all the orchids that inhabit North America. On a good year, some may be blooming as early as Orchid Fest, but generally one has to wait until mid-June to mid-July to see these beauties. Because of its unique range of ecosystems and climate areas, a number of Western orchids grow on the Bruce Peninsula. There's an impressive colony of Alaska orchids on Flowerpot Island, which blooms from late June through to July. With several small leaves at the base of the stem, the distinguishing feature is the stem, which can rise up to 35 centimeters with a graduated series of tiny green blossoms looking much like knots on a strand of dental floss. Occasionally, one can discover scattered examples of Alaska orchids on the mainland or on Manitoulin Island. The tall white bog orchids are rare on the Bruce Peninsula. At the fen in Oliphant or at the Petrel Point fen, anywhere from 1 to 6 might bloom in a particular season and never in the same place. They range in height from 10 centimeters to about a meter and are often located far off in the vegetation. They can be seen because white orchids in Canada often have an almost incandescent glow to them. Perhaps that is why some naturalists refer to this particular orchid as the bog candle. If you find one growing near the boardwalk and can safely get down, carefully smell it because the scent is delicate and sweet. Even though it is listed as growing on the Bruce Peninsula, we have never been able to discover the small round-leafed orchis, which blooms anytime between mid-June and mid-July. After 3 days of searching, we finally found the small round-leafed orchis growing among the damp sphagnum moss hillocks in Sibley Provincial Park near Thunder Bay. Ranging in height from 10 to 20 centimeters with small glossy green leaves at the base of the stem, its blooms can have purple or pink spots or stripes. Like most Canadian orchids, it occasionally comes in pure white. The grass pink or calipogan orchid has a wiry stem with blossoms ranging from shades of pink through to rich magenta. It can be between 15 and 25 centimeters tall and is most easily found in the fens at Oliphant and Petrel Point. The number that appear in these locations on the Bruce are much greater than we have observed anywhere else. Shining Lady's Tresses is one of the earliest of the tresses orchids to bloom. It is distinguished by the bright yellow patch, much like the yolk of an egg, in the center of the blossom. This is a small plant inhabiting the sand and gravel areas along the shores of ponds, lakes, streams, and rivers. The tallest are perhaps 18 centimeters. The lady's tresses or spiranthes orchids were named because early botanists thought that the close arrangement of the small florets resembles the segments of braided hair. The blunt leaf rain orchid has only one large oval leaf at the base and is up to 15 centimeters tall. Its scent is comprised of chemicals similar to those found in human body odor. This attracts mosquitoes, which gladly pollinate the orchid. In northern areas of North America, where mosquito populations are large, this orchid thrives. I particularly like the spotted coral root because it reminds me of pretty polka dot summer dresses worn by little girls. This example was photographed along the Lighthouse Trail on Flowerpot Island in early July. Its tiny seeds partner with its own particular fungus to grow into a plant and can thrive in similar conditions to the striped coral root. You can just barely see a striped coral root in the distance of the right image. As noted previously, the small green and yellowish orchids are often the most difficult to spot. It was only in 2015 when we finally discovered Lösel's twayblade at Oliphant Fen. Lösel's also grows in Europe and was named for a German botanist who lived in the 1600s. Subsequently, we found examples at Petrel Point and at Singing Sands, ranging in height from 5 to 6 centimeters. They don't appear every year and are usually uncommon. Arguably the largest and most spectacular orchid we've been able to document on the Bruce is the large round-leafed orchid. This example on flower pot is almost a meter tall with beautifully structured flowers. One of the prettiest Ontario orchids is the rose begonia. On the Bruce Peninsula, it often blooms in fens on tiny islands with pitcher plants, grass pinks, and sometimes tall white bog orchids. John and I wonder whether the pitcher plant plays a role in creating the ideal ecosystem for these orchids to thrive. In certain cases, we have seen only one example of a specific orchid. John discovered this single white adder's mouth orchid, less than 7 centimeters tall, when we were on a hike with the McNamara field naturalists of Arnprior, Ontario, around July 1st, 2015. Because orchids do not come up every year and many are small and blend in with the surrounding vegetation, they can be very difficult to find. The ragged fringed orchid is among the plants officially listed as endangered and rare in Canada. These specimens were photographed at Williams Bog near a suburb of Thunder Bay on July 15, 2016. Originally, a subdivision was supposed to be built on this land, even though it is marshy and subject to flooding. Because of the rare plants growing there, construction was halted to preserve the ecosystem. Sometimes it takes rare plants to save mankind from natural disasters. The ragged fringed orchid and the much rarer eastern prairie fringed orchid have marshy, difficult to access areas of the Bruce. Despite being about 5 centimeters in height, the green adder's mouth orchid makes up for lack of stature by producing a cluster of dozens of miniature blossoms. These plants were photographed under a low canopy of yews near Carden, Ontario in July 2016. This is another of the small green orchids that are challenging to find. The small purple fringed orchid can grow up to 70 centimeters tall and often appears in marshy areas where there is relatively fresh water. The plants can be widely scattered. These examples were photographed on the Bruce Peninsula near Singing Sands. Because of the wet spring in 2017, we were delighted to be able to see a record 3 dozen of these orchids blooming at Singing Sands in July of that year. To photograph the white fringed orchid, we drove all the way to Torrens Barrens, a black sky preserve near Bala, Ontario. It prefers sphagnum bogs where it can grow up to 50 centimeters tall. Look for it in similar areas of the Bruce. One of our rarest discoveries was the eastern prairie fringed orchid at a fen near Ottawa. This orchid favors areas with fresh running water. Today it is a rare and extremely endangered orchid in Ontario. Experienced botanists have estimated that fewer than 2,000 plants might grow in the province. I was able to smell one of its blossoms. The scent is sweet and pure. Experts have suggested that it was picked almost to extinction by past generations who appreciated its perfume. Late July and early August usher in a whole new range of orchids. The plantain orchids are characterized by a rosette of small, oval, fleshy leaves at ground level. The patterns on the leaves and their size often give the orchid its name. Checkered rattlesnake plantain is named because the pattern of spots on its leaves resembles those found on a Massasauga rattlesnake. Slender lady's tresses exhibits an arrangement of small bell-shaped white blossoms twisting around a very thin, wiry stem. When the plant is growing in moss, there may be no oval leaves visible at ground level around the stem. This orchid has the most subtle, sweet scent of all. The examples shown here were photographed at Singing Sands and ranged in height from 7.5 to 16 centimeters. The most successful species of orchid invading from Britain has been the helleborine. Its minute seeds likely came to North America in soil or other plant material. Standing anywhere from 5 to 80 centimeters, it blooms in late July and August, and even as late as October, in city gardens and in forested areas when all other wildflowers have ceased blooming. In the 1700s, botanists recognized that it was apparently pollinated by wasps. Only recently has it been discovered that the helleborine emits hormones, suggesting that it is being attacked by a juicy grub or caterpillar. This lures the female wasps, who are anxious to lay their eggs on the grub or caterpillar where they can hatch and eat it up. In Wisconsin, the helleborine is considered an invasive weed because it is so common and even grows up through cracks in the sidewalks. The clubspur orchid, with its creamy white blossoms and sturdy stems, is difficult to find. We managed to locate a small colony on a mudflat along the shore of a lake in Superior National Park. The tallest were about 20 centimeters. Hooded lady's tresses has blossoms with petals that project around the center, much like the brim of an early Victorian poke bonnet. The blossoms are more profuse and the plants about the same size as the slender ones. These were photographed at the high tide mark in Singing Sands, August 2015. One of the other common plantain orchids that blooms in late July and August is Menzies rattlesnake plantain. It can be identified by a wide white stripe extending down the center of its leaf. Rattlesnake plantains can be found both on Flower Pot and at Cypress Lake. The form and arrangement of individual florets is what distinguishes the different varieties of lady's tresses or spiranthes orchids. Nodding lady's tresses has the blossoms arranged in vertical bands up the stem. It is similar in size and habitat to the other lady's tresses that we discussed earlier. It is one of the 3 varieties of spiranthes where the blossoms are sweetly scented. In contrast, the autumn coral root is possibly one of the most nondescript in appearance. These examples, the largest being about 6 centimeters tall, were photographed in the Carolinian forest at the south end of Chatham, Kent in early September 2015. Some plants were actually almost miniatures. Often the lower blossoms do not open and self-pollinate. The upper ones may open and might be pollinated by tiny insects. Based on reports we've heard and the range of trees and soil, the south end of the Bruce might be the best area to search for these. We end our native orchid season on the Bruce with the Great Plains lady's tresses. This orchid is considered to be native to the grassy central plains of the USA. However, there's a colony in a conservation area near Carden, Ontario, and purportedly colonies at the south end of the Bruce Peninsula and in the vicinity of Rondo Provincial Park on Lake Erie. We were able to photograph the Great Plains lady's tresses near Carden in September 2015. It seems to thrive on the grassy albar with scattered trees and bushes and the potential for groundwater. It is possibly the most aromatic of the native orchids in Ontario, with a scent that is a combination of amaretto liqueur and fine vanilla. Some people can smell them before they see them. Great Plains lady's tresses bloom from September to as late as October. We hope that you've enjoyed seeing some of Ontario's natural treasures that can be found on the Bruce Peninsula. Are you able to recognize the white bog orchid, the grass pink or calopogon, and the pitcher plant? Orchids of Bruce and Gray is available through Ginger Press in Owen Sound, Ontario. Reader's Haven in downtown Tobermory has it for sale along with Orchids of the Northwoods, which provides detailed information about a similar range of orchids and their habitats in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, where ecosystems have much in common with the Upper Bruce. Remember, when you see one of these native orchids in bloom, that it has had to contend with many difficulties to grow and survive. Only about 10% or fewer of most of these orchids gets pollinated and produces many millions of minute seeds. Each seed must partner with a specific fungus in the wild to grow and survive. The fungus shares moisture and nutrients with the orchid and another host plant, usually a tree. It can take up to 15 years for an orchid to grow to blooming size and even then it may come up and bloom only when conditions are ideal. The little hooded lady's tresses that you see here beside a loonie is likely 12 years old, or older even. It was growing on the beach at Singing Sands in 2015, but is now probably underwater because of the rising levels of Lake Huron due to climate change. The Ontario Field Naturalists in Owen Sound offer excellent advice. When you go hiking, please remember the Naturalist's Code. Move nothing. Step on nothing but the path. Take nothing but photographs. Leave nothing but your thanks. By doing this, you can preserve Ontario's natural treasures for tourism and for future generations. If you would like more information about our native orchids or conservation projects in your area, you may contact the Southern Ontario Orchid Society's Conservation Committee through the SOOS email address, which is info, I-N-F-O, @soos.ca. Enter conservation into the subject line. John and I would be very remiss if we did not briefly show you some of the other floral treasures that you are likely to see at a real Orchid Fest. These include, left to right in the top row, dwarf lake iris with its beautiful blue flowers, bird's eye primrose with its pale mauve flowers with a darker eye in the center, and lakeside daisy. The dwarf lake iris and the lakeside daisy are unique to the Bruce Peninsula. Along the lower row, left to right, you can see another dwarf lake iris, the nodding trillium, which is normally found further north, purple polygala or gay wings, which can grow in large colonies, and again, the lakeside daisy with its bright yellow blooms. Remember that these are some of the wildflowers that feature in the hikes offered as part of the Orchid Fest program. Other flowers that bloom at the beginning of June include white trilliums, the provincial emblem of Ontario, which grows in large colonies, jack-in-the-pulpit, which you see in the top center, and pitcher plant, named for its large bulbous leaves. Pitcher plant leaves are open receptacles with water at the bottom and downward pointing hairs on the inner side. Insects enter the leaf hoping for a drink, can't get out, drown, and are digested by the plant. The pitcher plant is the floral emblem of Newfoundland. In the bottom row, you can see wild columbine and painted cup. Painted cup grows among the grasses along the shorelines and in the fields on the Bruce. It is partly parasitic. Apparently, its roots connect underground with surrounding plants to secure nutrients. In a good year, some of the meadows and roadsides on the Bruce can have red patches because of the proliferation of painted cup. It starts to bloom in late May, early June, and appears sporadically until August. In closing, John Alexander and I would like to offer our sincere thanks to the many people who have helped us along the way in our search for orchids. We especially remember Alison Stein and her wonderful husband, David, no longer with us, but still inspiring a quest that began in 2013. We hope that our presentation helps you to appreciate the wonderful natural legacy that is being preserved and curated on the Bruce Peninsula. Its ecosystems and geography are a natural treasure that can soothe our troubled lives and attract visitors from around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Peter. That was amazing. We have a few questions from some of the participants here, if you are ready and able to answer them.
Yeah.
So we have one from Ivy. She's asking about the Bruce Peninsula Orchid book. I assume the one published by the Owen Sound Field Naturalists that you were talking about. She said she purchased it 20 years ago. Is there a new one now?
No. It has been updated a couple of times and revised, but it's still the same basic book that it was 20 years ago.
Excellent. Okay, so Ivy, maybe you could get an updated version, but it is still the same book there. There's a question also from Linda, and perhaps Esme could also speak to this later on as well. But for you now, are there any strategies being implemented on the Bruce to save or increase the more rare endangered orchid species?
And I think as Esme is probably better qualified to answer what we would be. We have certainly worked with any field naturalist groups or Nature Conservancy of Canada when we've been hiking different areas, but on strategies for preservation, that would fall more into Esme's bailiwick, I'm afraid.
Wonderful. Oh, we've got more down here. From Jan, she's wondering, in order to take all of these photos, can you estimate how long you spent in the field to get them all?
Oh.
Well worth however long it took, she's saying.
I would say on average, we probably drive 10,000 kilometers a year, at least, and hike 40, 50 hours or more.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Easily. So it's, and sometimes we'll go on a hike and not find anything at all. And other times, one of the things that we've noticed going out hiking in other areas is that the Bruce area is really quite special because the amount of different species you can see in a relatively small area, where in other areas you might go for a hike for 3 hours and see one of those, where at the Bruce you might see 5 different species in an afternoon.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, in last year we went to Newfoundland and we were looking for orchids there. And on one of the days at Grossmorn Park, we hiked 11.6 kilometers and did the equivalent of 27 stories. So we get a lot of exercise.
Certainly do. Yeah. It's a hobby that keeps you very active, I'm sure.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that was all of the questions for now. We'll hold on to that one from Linda for Esme when it gets to her question period. But again, thank you so much, John and Peter. I will pass it back to Carolyn now.
Okay, thank you, Maddie.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, John and Peter, again, for sharing your enthusiasm and your time that you've spent searching for those orchids. And thanks to our participants who asked some questions. So coming up next is Esme Batten. She works at the Nature Conservancy of Canada as the program director for Midwestern Ontario. And she's based out of the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, where she's lived since 2014. She studied environmental science at Carleton University in Ottawa. And as a lover of natural history, Esme is lucky to live on the Northern Bruce Peninsula, where she spends most of her free time birding, botanizing, herping, hiking, paddling, doing some astrophotography, and just generally enjoying the outdoors. So I'd just like to welcome Esme.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, the organizers, for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about orchids. Despite everything going on in the world, it's great that we can still kind of share our passion for these amazing species. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Perfect. So as Carolyn mentioned, I'm Esme Batten. I'm the program director for Midwestern Ontario for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I've had the privilege of living here on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula since 2014. Admittedly, I didn't know very much about orchids actually before moving here. And throughout my various field positions, kind of got really well acquainted with the orchids of the Bruce Peninsula. And I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to interact with these really amazing species. So first of all, we had a really great presentation before this that went over some amazing facts about orchids. So I apologize if there's some repetition, but they did a fantastic job. So I did just want to touch on what are orchids, because I certainly didn't actually know very much about orchids kind of before I started learning more about them in my role as a biologist. So they kind of first appeared 200 million years ago. And they can be found pretty much everywhere in the world in a variety of habitats. And there's more than 25,000 species, which is pretty amazing. And it's actually one of the largest groups of plants that we have. And often when you think of orchids, at least for me, I kind of thought of wading through the swamps in South America and spending hours searching for these kind of elusive plants. But we're actually really lucky to have 62 species here in Ontario, an amazing 44 species on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula. And all of those species are native with the exception of two, which are Hellebrine and European Twayblade. So that's pretty spectacular, and you don't have to go walking through the swamps of South America like I'd originally thought to see them. So like I mentioned before, they can be found growing in most habitats. Here on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, we kind of joke sometimes that the yellow lady slippers are like roadside weeds, which they're certainly not, but they're so prolific you can often find large numbers of them growing on roadsides. So it's pretty spectacular, the kind of resilience of many of these species and the different habitats in which they can thrive. So one thing as I started to kind of learn more about orchids that I thought was really interesting is this kind of really complicated kind of dramatic history of how we kind of came to appreciate them. And so there's, in the mid-19th century, there's kind of this group of orchid hunters that began kind of trying to popularize orchids among horticulturalists. And so one of the most famous ones was Frederick Sander, and he was actually kind of the royal orchid grower for Queen Victoria. And he kind of employed a lot of bad boys of horticulture, as they were known, and he was kind of known as the Orchid King. And basically what they would do is they would go around the world, a lot, especially kind of Europe and South America, as well as across North America as well, in search of these really rare orchids. And so these, you can imagine, in the mid-19th century wouldn't have been easy trips. They would have encountered a lot of things like wildlife that they would have to deal with, difficult terrain. They would often be going to areas where they had an inkling of where to find these orchids, but not kind of directions to them. So it was a pretty tough job. And as part of this, there was also kind of this these dramatic stories that came out of kind of like gun battles on ships and pirates. There was even some kind of examples of some of the orchid hunters holding others hostage so that they could kind of capture their orchids so they weren't able to bring them back. And even once you did actually collect these orchids, you then actually had to transfer them safely back to Europe, which, as you can imagine, would have been really difficult. A lot of the time, you would collect maybe thousands of orchids and none of them would survive the journey. So it was definitely kind of the boom, I guess, of orchids and our fascination with them in today's world, especially as plants that we can pretty much buy at your general grocery store. So this kind of insatiable demand across Europe and America definitely had some pretty devastating impacts on these native orchid populations. There was one documented incident that I found that actually someone burned down an entire forest in South America just so that another orchid hunter couldn't collect this rare orchid. So we definitely still see some of these impacts today, and we even see them on their host trees. So as we heard earlier, epiphytic orchids are ones that kind of grow on trees. So as you would be extracting that orchid, there could actually be damage done to that host tree. So there's kind of these wide range of impacts of this that we are still seeing today. And we definitely still face some kind of evidence of orchid poaching still today, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So now that we've kind of learned some of the history of orchids, I kind of wanted to highlight some really neat facts I learned about some of our native species. We saw some really great photos of this one, grass pink, earlier in the presentation before. And this one is pretty commonly found in the fen kind of wetland habitats across the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, but you're certainly lucky if you do see one because they can be quite elusive. So all orchids have an enlarged petal called the labellum. And basically, this is where insects land to pollinate this orchid. So as you can see in that photo, the uppermost petal of grass pink, it's kind of covered in these like fine looking hairs, but they're actually not pollen-bearing stamens is what I meant to say. They're actually these modified hairs, and they act as a lure kind of to bumblebees that are their main pollinator. And so what happens is that labellum is actually hinged at its base. So when the bumblebee lands on it, it's expecting to get pollen, the weight of it actually causes that labellum to bend backwards. And if you can see at the bottom, there's kind of like a trough on the orchid, and the kind of surprised bumblebee being tricked by this kind of hidden hinge will kind of land on that kind of wing trough, and it'll be pinned by the weight of the petal. And then kind of as it crawls to freedom, the bee has pollen it's carrying on its body from moving around from other plants. And it basically, that pollen gets pulled from its body, and then it goes through this sticky glue, that kind of substance that picks up pollen as the bee leaves from kind of this temporary trap. So it's a really cool way that grass pink is actually getting pollinated, and it doesn't actually offer any rewards. It's just kind of tricking the bees. And interestingly, rose pogonia kind of also has these stamens that act as kind of, or hairs, sorry, that act as fake stamens. And if a bee visits a rose pogonia and a grass pink, pollen from one doesn't end up on the other flower. And it's because the two species deposit their pollen on different parts of the bee, and different sizes of bees are involved in the pollination of each plant. So I didn't know that until I started doing some research for this presentation, actually. So I thought that that was really cool. Another kind of interesting thing about the orchids that we have here on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, as well as kind of across Ontario, is that they're very much habitat specialists sometimes. So as we mentioned before, the yellow lady slipper is kind of a habitat generalist. So it can be found growing on roadsides. You can find it kind of the edges of fields in conifer forests where there's some access to sunlight. But some orchids, like this one pictured here, which is Ram's Head Lady Slipper, is actually very specific in the habitats that it occupies. And so this orchid actually is found in globally rare habitats, primarily called alvars. And we're really fortunate in Ontario that we have 60% of the world alvars. And otherwise, they can be found kind of in the Great Lakes region around the United States, as well as in kind of the Baltic region of Europe. And so we're really lucky to not only have this globally rare ecosystem, but that it also supports this provincially rare orchid. And so as you can kind of see from the shape, it gets its names from the fact that it kind of looks like a charging ram's head. And it can grow in alvars, and I should say alvars are kind of these open areas with little to no soil. And often on the Bruce, if you're going to what are called pavement alvars, people think that it could be a parking lot because they're so void of kind of other vegetation. And so there's different classifications of alvars depending on their levels of shrubs and tree cover, but you can most often find ram's head along their edges and kind of into like moist conifer forests, or what are called kind of finger alvars, or what I like to call them, across the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula. So these are actually pollinated by bees that are attracted to its sweet but kind of deceptive scent. And again, our orchids are kind of tricksters a lot of the time, and they pretend to offer a nectar reward when they don't actually. So what'll happen with most of the lady slipper species is there'll be a bee or another insect that'll kind of fly into the plant kind of after that sweet smell, looking for that nectar. And it'll be forced through, it can't get out the entrance it came, so it'll be forced through an entrance at the back of the plant that makes them push past the pollen sacs, and it's actually a tricky way of getting it to pollinate. So it's really kind of interesting, these different adaptations that different species of orchids have kind of taken in order to get pollinated without actually providing anything. So I think it was really cool. And so I did also want to kind of talk today about the work that I do at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and kind of why I'm here talking to you about orchids today and about our work. So NCC is Canada's leading not-for-profit land conservation organization. And since 1962, when we were founded, actually by 4 naturalists in Ontario, we've helped with our supporters to protect over 14 million hectares or 35 million acres of ecologically significant land across Canada. And so just to put that into perspective, because I know for me that's a hard number to visualize, it's almost 4 times the size of Vancouver Island and more than 20 times the size of Banff National Park and 25 times the size of PEI. So it's a pretty amazing accomplishment. And our mission is to protect Canada's biodiversity for future generations. And so on our properties, we've helped to protect habitat for over 223 species at risk. In Ontario, we've conserved 82,000 hectares or 208,000 acres. And so it's pretty amazing. Here on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, we kind of focus our work in trying to identify what our main targets are for conservation. And so those could be things like protecting our forests so that we can protect our forest nesting birds or breeding bird habitat, as well as protecting habitat for things like orchids. And then we work to kind of identify what their major threats are and then take kind of direct action to mitigate those threats. And so that's just a little bit about the work that we do at NCC. And definitely I did want to recognize a lot of our great supporters that have helped us protect habitat for endangered orchids or species at risk generally in this area, and especially recognize the Southern Ontario Orchid Society for their great support of our work, protecting habitat for the 44 species of orchids we have here. And so kind of to move on that point, I did want to kind of talk more about the threats that we have to our wild orchids. And I did want to mention that although these are going to be talking specifically about the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, they're pretty relative to the entire world and kind of good things that things to know that impact most of our species, whether it be plants or birds or turtles as well. So kind of good general message in terms of kind of what our threats are and then what we can do to kind of mitigate those threats. So one of them is habitat loss. That's one of the leading causes of decline of our wild orchids and native biodiversity across Canada. And that could be due to various things like residential development or commercial development. So it's kind of one of the leading causes of declines in our native orchid species, especially because they are so sensitive. Another one is invasive species. And I'm sure if I could see all your smiling faces right now, instead of just my computer screen, I would see you all raise your hands if I said, did you know what Phragmites is? Or most of you. And if you don't, it's Canada's leading invasive species, or Canada's worst invasive species, I should say. And it's a tall grass that grows kind of often on the sides of major highways. You can see it growing about 15 feet tall. It grows about 200 stems thick per 1 meter square. So as you can imagine, if there's kind of a dense stand of that, it's really difficult to move through for wildlife. If you're a tiny turtle, you often will get exhausted moving through big stands. It can actually cause death, unfortunately, in some of our native turtle species. It's really hard to kind of breed in if you're one of our native birds. And there is no habitat for our native pollinators because all of our native plants have basically been outcompeted by this invasives. And I should say that there definitely are differences between invasive species and those that are just non-native. And so kind of a non-native species would be one that's not typically found in Canada, and they're often brought by humans or wildlife, but we're often, unfortunately, the most likely culprits. And it's often unintentional. But non-native species are ones that don't really affect kind of natural habitat. So if you think of the common dandelion, you can often find it in our lawns or on the edges of trails, but it doesn't really grow in kind of undisturbed natural habitat. And that's the key distinction between kind of our invasive and non-native species, because invasive species actually thrive and outcompete our native species in their natural habitat. And basically what happens is our native species haven't been able to adapt quickly enough to kind of come up with their own checks and balances to keep those other species in check. And that's why we see such large population booms. And so one of the biggest impacts of invasive species, depending on the species, would be declines in, or at least to orchids, would be they overtake their habitat. So if you have a wetland that used to support rose begonias and grass pink, and white bog orchid, if you have it full of Phragmites, then there just isn't space for that species to grow. And similarly in forests, you might have Menzies rattlesnake plantain, for example, outcompeted by garlic mustard. So definitely invasive species have a huge impact on not only wild orchids, but just generally our native species. So it's definitely something to be aware of. And kind of one of the best things that you can do to kind of mitigate your ability or kind of responsibility of transferring these invasives is one of the biggest ways they're moved across the landscape into these kind of natural environments is through what we call spread vectors. And these are basically along roadways. So if you can imagine driving in your car, you're going up to a beautiful natural area from the city, you might unintentionally get a seed of Phragmites get stuck in the mud on your car tire. And then that might travel north with you. And it's actually been proven that they can travel, I think it's over 150 kilometers just stuck in the car, the mud in your car tire before it can kind of get pushed off and might be able to start a patch of Phragmites. So good practices are just to check you, your clothes, your backpack, your shoes, for anything that you might kind of unknowingly be bringing along. And definitely it's also really great to kind of familiarize yourself with what these invasives look like, because one of the greatest things and hardest things to do is to track them across the landscape. And so on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, really excited, NCC along with some partners got some great funding to kind of look at 4 priority invasive species and their management across the area so that we can actually manage them on public and private land. So we're really excited about the project, and certainly if you live here on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, you'll be hearing about it more soon. But in the meantime, if you can look for citizen science apps like iNaturalist and kind of learn about and report populations of these invasives, and that can really help mitigate that threat. Another kind of key threat to our orchids and especially orchids, but it can happen as well to other native wildlife, is poaching. Unfortunately, there have been several incidences of poaching observed over the past couple of years on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula. And so the biggest thing I would just say in order to kind of help mitigate the threat of poaching would just be to, if you do know of a population of a rare orchid, really think about if you need to share that information. And I often don't even share information that I have about these kind of rare orchids with people that I trust, just because you never know where else that information can get. And so you just really want to think what the benefit to that species is if you share that information. So with the iNaturalist app, for example, all that information is going to the Natural Heritage Information Center, where it can actually help conservation managers kind of make great decisions about how to protect these species. But it might not be beneficial to tell like a number of other people about it that might cause kind of trampling or disturbance in that area. So as a kind of thing for myself, I just think, what's the direct benefit to that species if I do that action? And if there isn't one, then I usually just don't do it. And that can be often a way to kind of stop poaching, especially of these kind of larger populations of rare plants. And finally, it was mentioned before, and I was really happy to hear it, trampling is one of the major threats as well to kind of our native orchid species. And what, as I'm sure we've kind of all heard, or I was really excited to hear about it, there's a lot of research going on about mycorrhizal communities, or kind of the root system of fungus, and their kind of ability to communicate and transfer energy or nutrients or sugars throughout the entire kind of forest ecosystems or ecosystems that we kind of interact within. And so what can happen is if we're walking in a natural space, say we're not on a trail where there's already been soil compaction, if we're walking, we could actually cause that soil to compact and break those really delicate, fine mycorrhizal strands. And that's kind of how some orchids especially kind of talk to tree species, or actually some of them just steal nutrients. So if you've ever seen orchids like spotted coral root or striped coral root, sorry, that's red and not green. It's because it's not photosynthesizing, so it's not creating its own energy. And so that energy has to come from somewhere. And striped coral root is actually saprophytic, so it kind of gets some of its energy and nutrients often from neighboring trees or other plants. And so if we accidentally step next to that plant, what we're doing is we could break that kind of delicate mycorrhizal connection, which is how those nutrients are being transferred, and unintentionally kill that orchid. So it's just something to think about. Again, kind of thinking if you see an orchid that you're really excited, because I totally get you. I also get really excited with seeing orchids. Just think about keeping a safe distance, at least a meter, like was mentioned before. And I kind of like to challenge myself to get cool photos with my zoom lens. So just try to think about kind of where you're stepping, and also think about what non-flowering orchids are around. So often Ram's Head Lady Slipper, you might find a stunning flowering example, but there might be 10 other non-flowering plants around you. So just be really careful, and we can all kind of enjoy these species for generations to come. So kind of getting more into what you can do to help protect some of these amazing species. It's kind of just considering habitat fragility. So again, in terms of if you're going into a fen habitat or a wetland, just thinking, do you really need to go into that area? Another one is considering an orchid and its rarity, and just thinking of the larger ecosystem. So again, if we're hiking in an area and we're looking for orchids, just think about what else we might be impacting. So if we're walking, say with a dog, keep your dog on leash so it's not causing disturbance, for example, to breeding birds or ground nesting birds in the area. And another one is just to stay on trail and walk softly, and then report sightings of things to community science apps like iNaturalist. And you can also be an environmental steward. And so I know here on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, organizations like Parks Canada, the Bruce Trail Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy of Canada are all looking for environmental stewards to help kind of monitor the properties that we manage, as well as to kind of share information in the community about some of the really cool species we have here. So that's always a great way to kind of get involved and see how you can help. And of course, one of the major threats to this species and all of the biodiversity we have in Canada is habitat loss. So helping to protect critical habitat through supporting organizations like NCC is a great way that you can help protect our orchid species. So I did kind of want to take a brief tour off of the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula for my last slide here, just to kind of talk about how a lot of these conservation problems that we face are not restricted to the areas in which we live. And so certainly through traveling to different countries or different areas, you can see that a lot of the problems that we face are actually very similar. And so I had a really great opportunity through two friends of mine, Rita and Eric, that I met actually on the Bruce on a hike looking for orchids with the Field Botanists of Ontario, to go down to Florida into the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve, which is in the Everglades. And it's one of the most biodiverse places for orchids. And I was helping one of the main biologists, Mike Owen, do some cool research on native orchid species as well as other plants. And it was really interesting because often as a biologist walking up here or elsewhere in Ontario, you're kind of always looking down if you're botanizing or looking for plants. But there you're always looking up because all of the orchids primarily are epiphytic, or ones that grow on trees. So this one here is a picture of a clamshell orchid that was growing on a fallen tree. And so it's just kind of a really unique experience. And I don't know if any of you have heard of the book or the subsequent movie based off of The Orchid Thief. And basically this is kind of a prime example of the impacts that poaching can have on a native population of not only orchids, but other species as well. And what happened was there was an individual who found a loophole that they could actually collect the rare ghost orchid, as well as other species of what are called, we know as air plants or tillandsias, and use them for kind of the illegal orchid or plant trade. And so this not only caused a really significant decline in the population of those plants, but it also introduced invasive species. So one of the species, unfortunately, was a weevil, and it impacted tillandsias, and specifically a really, really rare endangered tillandsia. And so that was part of the work I was kind of volunteering to do when I was in Florida. So we never really know what our impact can be, not only on that species, but kind of the species that are around if we're looking for a rare orchid, for example. So it's just kind of something to be aware of. I'm sure everyone here loves orchids and just wants to see them all protected and to enjoy their natural beauty. And I certainly encourage everyone to do that. But just kind of some food for thought about what we can all do to better conserve our orchids. So thank you guys so much. I've just had that information here in case you did want to get in touch with any questions about our work or any other orchid related questions after the presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Esme. That was awesome. We have a few questions for you here. We have one held over from the last presentation that I'll ask you now from Linda. I'll just repeat it again for everybody. Are there any strategies being implemented on the Bruce to save or increase the more rare endangered orchid species?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think kind of some of the main conservation actions that are currently being undertaken are those kind of more habitat protection. So that could be mitigating the threat of invasive species, for example, and habitat for rare orchids. And that's kind of one of the major ones. I know that there are definitely kind of like breeding programs or for other species at risk. But because orchids are so sensitive and so hard to kind of propagate, that isn't something that's currently happening on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, but definitely kind of habitat protection through invasive species management or direct land conservation are kind of the two major ones I would say.
For sure. Kind of going off of the invasive species comment there, Jan also asked a question, if you could tell her more about iNaturalist and how it might be used to prevent the spread of invasives.
Yeah, certainly. So I will not kind of promise to be an expert in iNaturalist. I should use it more than I do, much to my hatred of some of my coworkers that I don't. But it's really great kind of community science app that you can track anything that you see. And one of the greatest things about it is if you don't know what something is and you have your phone on you, you can take a photo. It actually has a really kind of unique ability to some sort of software to identify what it thinks you've seen. So it can be really helpful to identify not only invasive species, but other kind of native species as well. And if you record populations, say you were walking on a trail that I manage at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and you wrote that you saw some garlic mustard, I could then actually see that because land managers like me at NCC will download that data. And then we can actually go out, document it, take some notes, and then work on some various ways of controlling it. So it can be really, really helpful and save a lot of time for land managers that aren't able to go to all of these places.
It's kind of a win-win. You get to learn and you also get to help out. All right, I think that's it for questions. Thank you again. I am going to pass it back to Carolyn now.
Perfect, thanks guys. I just see one more question actually from Ivy. She's wondering, what are the orchids we buy in the grocery store and why can they thrive in flower pots indoors in our homes? Esme.
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of those orchids, as was mentioned before, we have kind of 25,000 species of native orchids and then about 100,000 species of orchids otherwise. And so those, some of them would be bred through other orchids. So I think it's just that they've basically been bred to be pretty happy in various conditions and kind of selected the ones that are easier to care for. I know that there are some species that are much trickier to care for at home than others, but the ones you find at the grocery store, I think, I'm sorry, I can't be certain on this, but they basically are usually selected varieties that are kind of less picky in terms of their growth habitat.
Awesome, thank you. So I just want to thank
No
Esme
problem.
for your expertise and your passion on the subject, and to all of our participants tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in with us to learn more about our resident orchids and some of our conservation efforts that surround those. I also want to say a big thanks to the Friends of the Bruce District Parks Association for hosting us, and to our other guest speakers, John and Peter. I hope to be able to see everyone in person at next year's Orchid Festival. Take care of yourselves, everyone, and take care of your environment. Have a wonderful night.